Hello, this is the Coach and Benway podcast. I'm your co-host, Coach Redpill, and with me is Dr. Benway. Dr. Benway, why don't you take it away?
Yeah, so, it's funny how you and I have kind of talked about economic issues around and around, and yet we never really talked about what we think of or how we responded to the quote-unquote great financial crisis, all of those, what is it like? We're 10 years into it, aren't we?
Yes, it's been 10 years since the global financial crisis. And for me, it was a seminal moment. I mean, I don't know about you, but for me, it demonstrated that the people in charge, the powers that be, they don't know what the hell they're doing. I mean, they're just morons as far as I'm concerned. And they've been just stumbling along ever since. I mean, I'm surprised at how reckless they were. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the global financial crisis, and we're going to talk about the mainstream press. Because what was your impression at the time?
So I'll do a little bit of, this may be a long-winded, but I think it's my personal story has like 3 moments in it, which that I think were interesting, not just by virtue of saying what I think about what was actually going on and who was saying what about it, but also how it kind of impacted my personal and my professional life, because it actually kind of culminated in a kind of red pillish moment for me. So this all happened right when I was graduating college, and the whole point of like, I got to try to find a job right around, the summer of '08, right when a lot of the events were happening. I mean, Lehman had, kicked the bucket by September, but that summer, it was an odd thing to, figure out what you wanted to do and how you could get a job in that climate, particularly if you were someone in like an elite university level. So I wound up working at the university for like a year or so while I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, ultimately getting into a form of consulting, which was, ironically enough, it was like economic expertise in a litigious setting. So what often happened, because a lot, the years I was there were in the direct aftermath of the financial crisis, is I actually was in a lot of the civil cases that came about as a result of this. So as part of the things I had to do was actually look in the way all these securities that were built around the housing mortgage crisis, the subprime loans packaged into.
So let me get this straight. So you actually like looked at this whole situation in the setting of litigation going on around these products?
Yep. And usually I was associated with the defense.
Oh, really? Okay. So what was the defense's case?
Well, the defense's case was that, there was no sort of secret scam going on. It was based on all the ratings information available, the way that these securities were structured,
okay,
the historic.
Wait, sorry to interrupt you, because I'm realizing something that our audience probably has no idea what we're talking about. So, or a lot of people don't know. So let me just give a little background. A lot of these. The best quick précis to understand this stuff is to watch the movie The Big Short. Benway, would you agree with that? That's like the easiest way to learn this stuff quickly, right? And the basic stuff was that the bonds, mortgage bonds, they were rated AAA when the people who had created these bonds knew that they were really dodgy and very risky, and that they had sold them knowingly to customers who had thought that they were buying AAA bonds, but were in fact buying junk bonds. And the litigation after the crash was over this issue of the ratings. So I'm sorry, Benway, go ahead. You were saying?
Yeah, and the funny thing is, looking at it, what was shocking to me was how much it really wasn't necessarily nefarious as much as it was like bungling. So the best way to describe, you can say, like, how the hell can you get a collection of securities that are subprime, in other words, really low rated home loans that seem risky, and have it rated AAA? Well, the easiest way to describe that is this. I'll just give a very simple example. It's called over collateralization in the business. So here, the story is this. Let's say you take $1 billion worth of subprime securities, but you say to yourself, okay, I'll sell those to people, but I'm going to sell it this way. The top tiers of think of that this collection of securities is like a company, and the highest tiers of debt that you're going to buy from me to kind of these security instruments are going to be the first ones that are going to get paid off. So I'm not even going to say there's $1 billion worth of securities you're going to buy. I'm going to give you a top sliver of it, maybe a couple $100 million. And basically, if anything goes bust, all of those other securities below you are going to get, digested to pay you out. So, and you can add it all up and say, well, I'm only really selling $500 million worth of securities. Everything else is going to be treated like equity. You can risk that investment. You can pay a really ridiculous discount on it. And hey, when the market's doing really good, and even if people default, there's a good enough recovery rate out there whereby you actually may make quite a bit of money on that deal. So that's how they got around with saying, at the end of the day, yeah, those highest tiers of securities have so much of a buffer zone between them and getting fucked that, yeah, they are AAA rated. And the funny thing was that this the ratings agencies actually told the security guys, well, look, if you want a AAA rated security, you'd have to structure it this way. It's sort of like saying, if you want to succeed on the test, here's what I'm going to test you on. And if you build it to the success parameters of the test, yeah, it's fine. So what the problem was, not so much that, they knowingly were trying to fuck you. Mm-hmm. That maybe a little bit of that, but it was just, they had too much confidence in their ability to recover defaulted securities. That over collateralization, they thought, well, it's going to be so monumentous a disaster before we even get to the point where we're all fucked. But the thing is, it did get to that monumental disaster. That recovery rate was the key kind of challenge that fucked everything up, because it all kind of cascaded through things. Now, and you wonder, that seems odd. Like, well, you just have to remember the monumental scale of investment that was going on in the housing and real estate industry. To understand just how bad, if one community goes down, you have all of these securities impacted as a result of that. So, the fact that, observing all of these little details, gave me an impression of a financial industry which wasn't so much one of geniuses as much as it was of guys who were frankly just overconfident and not really intelligent with regard to their risk appetite. So, that was one piece. And the other piece that I saw come about afterwards, which really made me pause and think, was the whole Occupy Wall Street movement. So I'll tell you the story that happened. It was in the offices of the company I was working with that was actually investigating all of this stuff. We're having lunch and we're looking out our window, and it was one of the Occupy Wall Street protests going around.
This was happening in Manhattan or elsewhere?
Yeah, this was happening in Chicago. So it was happening all over the place. Occupy Wall Street, ironically enough, was a nationwide event. It wasn't just like the Zuccotti Park, protest and incident. Yeah. It was going on all over. And so one of my colleagues, and this is the other thing that you have to keep in mind, my colleagues were limousine liberals, for lack of a better term. Yeah. They were, upper middle class, overprivileged, generally speaking, white kids who never really had to sit much with working class people by any stretch of the term. And they're looking down at the window at these people protesting. And I remember this one girl, like I said, stereotypical liberal girl that everybody in our crowd would want to hate. But I was kind of indifferent to her. And she basically looked down and said, why are these people protesting? Why don't they spend all this effort to look for a job? And I just stare at her for a long time and saying, do you not know what the fuck just happened? Do you not understand that there probably is no, or very difficult to find a job to get? And I'm just, the utter hypocrisy and ignorance and indifference rubbed me the wrong way to such a degree that hatred that was developed within me towards that group of people has never left. Like I said, that's approximately, let's say 9 or 8 years ago.
Yeah, but you still wear a suit to work, so you're basically a deep cover agent in that class. I'm sorry, I had to tease you, man.
To a certain, I've thought about this question: am I a class traitor on some level? Probably. Probably. And I don't mean just like, that doesn't mean all wealthy people inherently, are
that's
anti-right wing. That's an overgeneralization. But is there a certain type of person who went to the kind of university that I did, who gets the job that I kind of do, who does the kind of work that I do? In other words, the managerial class, as it were. Mm-hmm. Am I betraying that class? Yes, you're goddamn right I am.
Yeah, because my thinking is that Okay, well, I came at the whole GFC from a completely different point of view, but let's step back a bit before we go into like the personal vision of the whole thing, because I'm very curious about that. But I want to talk about the overall view of it, because in my own case, what happened was that in 2006, 2007, I was coming off a very rocky period. I'd been involved in a long litigation that I won, but as like with all litigation, there's a great deal of wear and tear on you on a psychic level, right? And it had been a big litigation that had gone on for like, I don't know, a couple of years. And it came to a settlement, because all litigation ultimately is settled. And I got a big check and everything was hunky dory. I got more or less what I wanted. But it was rough on me. And so I was not feeling that good going into 2007. And so I sort of like was basically on the sidelines. I wasn't really doing much. And I started realizing that, things were out of whack. And I had some investments. And also, what happened was that there was a situation where I found myself having to deal with the financial assets of someone during a period of crisis, because it was very clear that things were going south. The markets were very just erratic, and Bear Stearns crashed. I actually forget when Bear Stearns crashed, but that was for me
I believe it was March of '08.
It was March of '08. Yeah. That's when
I think, yeah.
that's when I started thinking to myself, I'm looking it up as we're speaking. That's when I started thinking to myself, what's going on? Okay, what the hell is going on? And it was sort of like, because it wasn't just 2008, it was like from 2007. And by 2008, I'm really paying attention to the markets. I'm starting to manage this money, and I'm paying a lot of attention to what's going on. And I'm very cautious because it's not my money, it's somebody's nest egg. I have to be very careful with it. And things started just going down the tubes. And it was just a steady and relentless thing. And I had no idea about mortgage-backed securities. I had no idea about pretty much anything, because though my old man had been into banking, I myself was not that. I knew economics, macroeconomics, the different macroeconomic schools. I knew basic finance enough that I could, look at a balance sheet and make sense of it. But I was not that financially sophisticated. And through 2008, I found myself basically having a crash course in finance and macroeconomics and mortgage and securities and bonds and the whole thing. Just a crash course in the whole thing to figure out what the hell's going on. Because I was getting very, very nervous. And since I was managing this money, I was worried that I might make a horrifying decision, because it was clearly clear in early 2008 that we were going into a crisis period. Anybody who claimed otherwise was just ridiculous. And I remember watching the MSM. I remember watching what's this guy, Jim Cramer, saying that everything was fine, Bear Stearns was fine, and then Bear Stearns crashed just shortly thereafter, making him look like a fool. And I realized, these guys are selling me bullshit. Now, here was a key issue for me, was that, see, way back in the 80s, when I had been a high schooler, I'd been living in Chile, doing high school in Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship. And I would read Time magazine, which was, at that time, Time magazine, the global news magazine, right? I mean, it was like a big deal. And there had been this full-page article about some bodies that had been found in Chile. Now, these bodies that were found in Chile, they'd been found in the north of Chile, in the desert, the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert in the world. Now, these bodies, I think there were like 16 bodies. They were found in, I think this must have been 84, 85. And the article painted the picture like, the bodies found of the military dictatorship, blah, blah, blah. And what happened later is it came out that these bodies had been of some military patrol from the 19th century, okay? Apparently some soldiers had been out on some patrol in the middle of the goddamn desert and gotten lost. And there were records of these people having been lost. And the bodies were found in the middle of the Atacama Desert. And because it's so dry, they were relatively intact. And it was easy to determine them from the clothing and from other...
Right.
There was no question. But the thing is, see, the way the article phrased it and talked about the Chilean situation, because the Time magazine article used it as a jumping off point to talk about how the situation in Chile was, I'd read all those items, and they were completely wrong. They were talking about the Chilean situation, and I was there, and it was bullshit. It was just wrong information, up to and including the picture. Now, this has been a full page article, a full page piece in Time magazine, which was a big deal. I mean, Time magazine at that time had maybe, I don't know, 50, 60 pages of actual news, and the rest were ads, right? Or less, perhaps. And so a full page article on a country was like a big deal. Remember, Time magazine was the global news magazine at this time. This is, like I say, 84, 85. The picture that they'd used had been of this cemetery with all these iron crosses, okay, in the desert. And in the distance, you see the ocean. Now, you see the picture, and it's very dramatic, and you think that they must have found hundreds and hundreds of bodies because there are hundreds and hundreds of crosses. And the line underneath the picture had said, basically, bodies found in Chile, you know? And so you look at the picture, and you think, my God, they found thousands of people. But the picture was of one of the cemeteries in the north of Chile. And they're very famous precisely because there's no wood. And so people make crosses out of scrap metal or iron or what have you. And now, of course, these crosses in the salty sea air, they tend to corrode. And it's very, very beautiful. I mean, in fact, tourists go to look at the cemeteries because they're so stark and beautiful, frankly. And so, you know, they're putting that picture that gives a warped vision of how many people that were found and the circumstances of it. And you read the article, and it's saying things that some of the information is objectively true, but the way that they're slanting it is not true. And so that was, for me, the red pill moment. Like, if they're saying this shit about Chile, which I know is not true, what about when they talk about South Africa, which is another big story in the news at that time, apartheid and all that? When they talk about South Africa, are they selling me bullshit like the bullshit that they're saying about Chile? That was my red pill moment. I didn't fall for the Gelman fallacy. The Gelman fallacy is that you read several news articles and then you come to one where you actually know the subject and you realize that it's bullshit, but then you read the next article and assume that the newspaper writer, the news person is correct, and you just take it at face value. That didn't happen to me. I didn't fall for that fallacy for whatever reason. I just instantly assumed that people were lying to me about the other stuff because they were so clearly lying or misrepresenting the situation in Chile. When the GFC happened, and I saw the mainstream press misrepresenting the situation so radically, because they had been telling me just a few days before that Bear Stearns was hunky-dory, and then Bear Stearns crashes spectacularly. Then I thought to myself, you know, all bets are off. And that's when I started reading the alt media. And I suspect you did too.
Well, the thing that the GFC, well, before I even get there, the other thing to keep in mind, at least for someone my age or older, would be that we already had in the immediate years preceding that a go around at the media uniformly, shall we say, adjusting the details in the lead up to the Iraq War.
Yeah.
So we had a taste of it, and literally right on top of that, by only a few years later, the thing that got to me about the financial crisis wasn't even so much whether they were lying to me or not, as much as there was a uniform understanding and a simplified description, which was with regard to the bailouts and the government practices with regard to Wall Street. We, you know, if nothing had been done, this, would have been a disaster and something needed to be done. What they were really saying is the exact details of what happened had to be done. In other words, Paulson had to have gotten his bill through the House to get TARP funding. That had to happen. And I was thinking to myself, it's like, no, it didn't have to happen. Nothing has to happen ever. In fact, at first it didn't happen, and we were punished and said, you have to make it happen. And that attitude of uniformly just acceptance of the powers that be deciding what needed to happen and how it needed to happen was part of it too. I'm like, okay, I see what's going on here. I know what happens when all the ducks get lined up, and it's usually not something very good.
Yeah.
And so that's a different version of what you said, but that was my take on it at the time.
Yeah, because I remember the when they tried to pass TARP, and we're hopscotching all over the GFC, but they were talking about the TARP, and it failed to pass the first time. And the amount of political pressure that Paulson and his crew brought to bear on Congress was spectacular, and it was on all fronts. It was a political fight on Capitol Hill. It was a political fight in the White House. It was a political fight in the press. I mean, all the mainstream press was saying that the congressman had been irresponsible for not passing TARP. My own thinking at the time was that capitalism, let it fail. Let it go bankrupt. Let the chips fall where they may. They made bad decisions, and this is going to lead to bankruptcy. So be it. Big banks are going to collapse and disappear, and so be it. That's life. Life sucks. To save these things is you're trying to maintain the status quo, and the status quo is what led to this. So obviously, the status quo is not what we want. We want to allow change, and that was my thinking at the time. And all of the mainstream press, man, they were all in lockstep. That's the thing.
Yeah, and then here is the other thing that also kind of bothered me, and to a certain extent still bothers me, is the degree to which the mainstream press was very happy and quick to adopt the phrase, you know what it is, too big to fail.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that, a company is just too large and it's too important to the economy to let the market decide, so we will deal with it, which is effectively saying that there is no such thing as a free market at that point, one.
Yeah.
Two, the other thing that logically you would want to go to, which no one ever did, which was to say, okay, it's too big to fail. How do we make it not big anymore? In other words, how do we reduce them to smaller concerns that are a little bit more manageable? No one ever said to do that. Nobody ever wanted to do that. Whether they thought it or not, the fact that it never got brought up means they treated the matter as a non-viable issue. And I was always saying, well, why the fuck not?
Yeah.
You're basically just saying we have an Achilles heel and we should have an Achilles heel.
Yeah, exactly. Who was it who said if it's too big to fail, then it's too big to exist? There was somebody famous who said that, and it's absolutely true.
Oh, I forgot who it was, but it's a good line, isn't it?
Yeah, it is a good line because it's absolutely true. Okay, I mean, no institution should be so big that it would break the whole system if it fails. Then that's wrong. Well, this all goes back to the Greenspan notion that monopolies are okay to have. This is the flip side of it. When your monopolies start to collapse, it means, and the whole system is going to go down the tubes with the failure of that monopoly. Well, then obviously your whole idea of allowing monopolies to exist is a horrible idea. And this was a Greenspan notion. I mean, we've been living under the yoke of this notion of too big to fail, of over-centralization, of allowing bigness to flourish in the foolish idea that monopolies are more efficient, which is true, and therefore monopolies can deliver lower prices to consumers, which is also true, but at the cost of a very, very unstable system. And look, since 2008, let's face facts. The Federal Reserve has not acted in any way that creates long-term stability. They have acted to put out fires. For the last 10 years, they've been the fire department of the financial system. And they've been floating all of this free money, basically free money, which has destroyed yields, and so that it's destroyed savers, and it's benefited nobody except people who are trading in assets, who are trading and buying up assets with leverage, gearing up to buy assets. That's basically the only people who have benefited from this system of low interest rates, and it's going to tank eventually. Okay.
Leverage is a good word to remind people what it means. I'm sure a lot of our listeners know, some may not. And that's because it's a very big concept. I want to bring it up. Leverage is the idea that for every dollar of thing you actually have, money, you can have additional dollars in multiples of debt above and beyond that you can operate off of. And that's a big deal because beforehand, for a long time, half the banking industry was treated in such a way as to, you really couldn't have too much debt. That was too much riskiness in the system. And then in the years preceding the financial collapse, they said, no, you're not a certain kind of bank. You're a different kind of bank, which means you can take more risk, which means you can really load up on debt. And that was kind of like the big deal. And part of the reason I bring this up is, and it's based on something you just said, it was the idea of, for the longest time, the bankers were always thought of as the smartest guys in the country.
Yeah.
So when you go to a school like you did and I did, you probably know this ratio. There's generally the idea that when we get into some sort of working environment, you can break down into three categories. A third of the school goes into banking, a third goes into consulting, a third goes into everything else.
Yeah.
And the banking and consulting and banking, but more so banking in those years, was treated as if you were really top of your game, you went into there because that was with smart people doing smart things and making a lot of money out of it.
Yeah, I was recruited for an investment bank. I was recruited for
Right.
Goldman, as a matter of fact. You won't believe by who. But the point I'm trying to make here is that I think that okay, to polish off the previous point I was making, you see, the notion of, how can I put it? Okay, monopolies are my bugaboo. Okay, monopolies I think are catastrophic for an economy, and the fact that this has been existing for 50 years now, a concerted effort to allow monopolies to happen by the American regulatory framework. I had not really noticed this until the last 5 years, 10 years. Actually, really from the global financial crisis, with the phrase "too big to fail," because I always thought too big to fail, too big to exist, right? And back in 2008, 2010, I'd been positing that they should, instead of spending the money on TARP, they should have used that cash to set up new banks. Imagine if they'd set up, how much was it? $700 billion? Imagine if they'd set up 10 banks capitalized at $70 billion each. That's a whole shit ton of money, right? And just like drawn people from the successful savings and loans banks, small regional banks with good teams, and just drawn them up, or basically gone out and bought them, and capitalized them with $70 billion a pop, and just amped them up so that they could go out and compete with these collapsing banks and like started anew. You know what I mean? Look, it was a half-assed idea, but the point I'm trying to make is that to have patched up these monopolistic banks as opposed to letting them fail I think it was catastrophic. I'm not being
no. You're right. But here's the other thing that was part of this, and it'll make me sound like a lefty for saying it, but it's the truth of the matter, was that the revolving door between finance, the regulators, and the seat of government was despicably loose. Remember, Paulson was the head of Goldman Sachs.
Yeah.
All of the guys you can think of were, so a lot of the Citibank guys were in the various government.
Geithner was a career bureaucrat, but he was in the pocket of Goldman, right? He was Hank Paulson's best boy. What's his name? The Ross guy at the New York Times. That guy was in bed with all those guys. He was a cocksucker. He had broken out the knee pads outright, and he was sucking their cocks all day. He did that book, Too Big to Fail, right, that they turned into the movie with William Hurt playing Hank Paulson, right? And, it's all like cheerleading, like they had nothing to do, and they were like the heroes. Like these bankers were the fucking heroes.
That was the worst part, when they made it seem like Hank Paulson is a guy brooding, thinking about how to save this business, and he's talking about all the mechanisms of it. And I just, when they got to that point in the movie, I'm like, you just shut the fuck up.
Yeah, I know, man.
That was very annoying to see that. But it goes
very
back
annoying. That's very.
It goes back also because like Rubin, I think, who was Clinton's.
Treasury Robert Rudin?
Robert Rudin, he was also a Goldman guy. Or Citi guy.
Yeah, he had been the guy leading Goldman before Paulson, and then he would go on to lead Citi. These fuckers, it was just a revolving door, and they would do things that were. Look, there was that old saying back from the 50s: "What's good for General Motors is good for America," right? That notion that. What's good for these big corporations, or these big banks in this case, is what's good for America, and consciously identifying the good of individual corporations with the good of the economy is fucking insane. But that's what they did, But man.
Well, but it's also let's also keep things also into perspective. General Motors, at least at the end of the day, was building cars that were literally driving on the street.
Yeah, at least.
Goldman, loves to play the game that like, oh, we're investing in all these wonderful
They're
things. It's
doing
like you
God's
are
work.
selling
They're God's work.
yeah, you all you're doing is moving ones and zeros around
Yeah.
on the system. You don't even trade hard cash anymore.
Yeah.
That's what was bothersome to me.
And for
And
those,
it was also, but
for
it also
listeners,
tells.
hang on, just a quick. Okay, if people think that I'm insane for having said I'm doing God's work, for those listeners who don't know, I'm mocking Lloyd Blankfein, the current chairman of Goldman Sachs, who in some fucking speech said that what Goldman Sachs was doing was the Lord's work or some shit like that. What was the line exactly? Do you remember?
All I know is that it's a line that, if said a few hundred years ago, would have resulted in him being hung.
Yeah, stoned.
Deservedly
No,
so.
stoned to death. Stoned to death. Not even hung. Yeah. Okay. So I'm sorry. I cut your flow. What were you saying?
No, but so it's a roundabout way of saying your idea, which is to say, let's try to create a more competitive situation against these guys, wouldn't slide, because these guys think to themselves, rightly, whether they'll admit it consciously or they just keep it subconsciously, they think we run this show. That's why you'll never see us regulated.
No. I disagree. I mean, I see your point, and it's a valid point, but I actually disagree. I think it's more subtle than that. I think that they think that the corporations that they worked at all of their lives and grew up with, and who form a part of their persona, of their psyche, they can't see them fail. They cannot envision a world where Goldman Sachs does not exist, for instance. See, and whereas a true career bureaucrat would see, oh yeah, Goldman Sachs can disappear. Big deal. You and I can envision a world without Goldman Sachs. They can't. They can't envision a world without Citi. That's the thing for them.
I disagree on that. I know that culture. I mean, Goldman loves to play that game like, hey, we have all our guns pointing out of the house, where everybody else has their guns pointed at each other. But that's fucking bullshit. All these guys are really cared about is making sure that their continued income streams continue. These guys don't give a shit about preservation of anything in a long-term sense. You could tell based on their investment attitudes. They don't. I'm sorry. I'm going to fight you.
I'm not. It's not something that I'm willing to. If you beat me on that one, so be it. I don't really care. I think that they're all scum. Here's the thing. Here's the thing. You and I went to similar universities in the sense of, it was a third investment banking, a third consulting, and a third everything else, and lots of lawyers and doctors. Now, we both went to universities where, let's face facts, the people who went there, they had two qualities, one very good and one very bad, potentially very bad, or perhaps it's very bad in combination, which is they were very intelligent, and also very hardworking. That's something else that people forget, because all of these people are very hard workers. Very intelligent, very hardworking, but very compliant. Because you get into a top-tier college by complying with what is expected of you. For those of you who don't know, Benway went to University of Chicago. I went to Dartmouth. We both got accepted to a whole bunch of different schools, and we both saw the kinds of students who go there, which are people who are high in compliance. And they are very conservative, regardless of their political beliefs. But they are conservative in the sense that they don't like change. They like things to stay as they are. They like the system to remain static because it benefits them, because they climb through the system. That's how they got to the top tier school, and that's how they got to the big investment bank position. They don't want structural change, and they will fight structural change.
Well, I'll give you an example. It's anecdotal, but it's pretty much, I think it's a broader case of truth. A lot of the banking guys that I know came through the fraternity system. Partly because, one, the fraternity system has the connections into banking, and two, the fraternity system, if you really think about it, is a very structured way of organizing men and through the sororities, women. It's similar. You take that attitude that you get from that kind of lifestyle and you add it into the banking. It's not an accident, I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, well, because if you're a bank recruiter, what are you looking for? You're looking at somebody who's going to carry out orders and quickly, who is very energetic and very smart, but is not going to question an order. Okay, he's not going to question the morality of it or the legality of it, right? Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, we all know what investment bankers are. They're fucking. It's usury. That's what it is. It's high-flying usury. and it depends on being very quick and very aggressive and ripping off your clients. I mean, you and I both read Liar's Poker, right? Liar's Poker, which Michael Lewis cannot fucking believe it that so many people come up to him and say, "Oh, I read Liar's Poker, and because of that, I decided to be an investment banker." When the whole point of the book, and that's the point I took off of it when I read it, was that these people are fucking horrible. It's a completely immoral system of
But you
rapacious
know that
capitalism.
this is common, right? This added to this, like you think you're making a criticism and people love it. Wall Street, Wall Street made so many fucking douchebags want to get into finance.
Yeah, I know. And it was precisely because of a Liar's Poker that I didn't want to get into banking and finance. Okay, and I went to a recruiting thing, sort of like for fun, and the fact that I was smart, articulate, and Latin American, and presumably well connected in Latin America, was why investment banks were like, "Oh, really? And oh, you went to this school in Latin America." And here's the creepy thing: they fucking knew the different schools in Latin America, and which were like the right schools and the wrong schools. What are the good private schools in the States? Phillips Exeter,
Right.
Andover. Which other? Well, okay, it doesn't matter.
They're good enough. Yeah.
Yeah,
You know.
they
Yeah.
knew the good schools in fucking South America where I came from, and they knew that I'd gone to one of them. Okay, and it was just fucking weird. Okay, it was fucking weird. But then on the other hand, I'm realizing, yeah, these guys, this is their game. They're fucking sleazy as fuck because they
Well,
want somebody
also,
well connected so that they can sell their products, right? And
well,
and the
precisely.
Liar's Poker, it showed that these guys are con men in the literal sense because they know that their product is going to fail, and yet they get the money from it, from the client.
And now, there's a part of the reason people should know what investment bankers do as well. So, investment bankers are not necessarily traders. Trader guys are the ones who sell this and buy the securities. Investment bankers, best way to think of what they do, they're like agents in Hollywood. They have a client on either like who wants to buy something or a client who wants to get sold to someone. And they go shop around like saying, "Oh, like someone would say, oh, this studio's making this picture and I want this actor to it." They effectively do the same thing, but with companies at the end of the day. So they're fundamentally predicated on relationship building and knowledge of who's doing what, when, and where, and why. So
Exactly.
the fact that they're looking for, oh, you went to a good school, where other guys who went to that good school who also have successful careers and these potential targets that we want to have, that's what we want to know. That's how the bankers operate. Ironically enough, the investment banking arms of a lot of these companies that are associated with investment banking aren't even the most profitable sections of the business. It's certainly the most prestigious and reputation building, but because they cost so much to pay off these guys, it's actually not the most profitable. It was always trading that was always
Yeah.
the most profitable. And funny enough, by the time this financial crisis came about, a lot of the leadership of the various banks actually came from the trading side, not necessarily the investment banking side. Lloyd Blankfein, head of Goldman Sachs, actually was from the trading desks. He
Yeah.
didn't come from the iBank.
Yeah, but the problem is the thing is, see, what's key is that a lot of the traders, especially in the prop desks, the proprietary trading, that is the trading that the bank is actually doing for itself, right? A lot of them depend on the iBankers for the relationships, for the insider knowledge that nobody else can garner about the specific companies that they target, either to buy the stock or sell the stock. And of course, you buy long and sell short. Okay, these guys are all about maximizing profits. They're not interested in just getting stuff on their books and then getting it off. It's always the longer or shorter position to maximize the profits, because these guys, they just want to make fucking money. And that's why they have the iBanking arm, because of the proprietary information. Of course, the way that information is passed along between the two, there's supposed to be an iron wall between trading and investment banking, because the investment bankers know so much information. But it's so easy for that to make that wall permeable. Okay, the only way to really make that wall thick as iron is to split the bank, the investment bank, into the investing arm and the trading arm. But because of the repeal of Glass-Steagall, because Glass-Steagall made it illegal, right?
I think it did, and at the very least, this is also related to, and I think it may have even been Glass-Steagall, which was depending on what type of bank you were, there were certain rules that of what you could and could not finance and what information you could and could not use,
Yeah,
and that was what was getting blurred
yeah,
in the lead up to this, and
yeah.
that was related to that leverage point I was making.
Yeah, because look, the elimination of Glass-Steagall, which happened during the Bill Clinton administration, and they were giddy about it, and Robert Rudin was like, he was Treasury Secretary at the time, and he was just, he had that famously stoic face he's got, and he had that big fucking smile when they finally signed the repeal of Glass-Steagall. This allowed for monopolistic banking practices. This allowed for too big to fail. Okay, well, it was one of the steps, one of the big steps, but it was just a whole series of steps. But I think that the key issue was the mentality of it, the mentality of allowing too big to fail, the worship of bigness, which I think is catastrophic, not just in finance, but across the entire economy. I am so against bigness because it concentrates too much power in too few hands, and a few relationships and a few key people, and a bad decision can just wreck the entire economy, as what happened in the GFC. And the other thing I hate is the press, man, because the press, they were always such whores. The financial press, they were always such suck-ups because they were like the poor cousin who wanted to hang out with the rich cousin, and hang out with the rich cousin and go to all his parties, but didn't have the wallet to be able to go. And so the rich cousin is springing for his restaurant bill and his little, for a little cruise or whatever. I mean, that's how the investment bankers and the banking system bought off the press, the mainstream press. Just
Do you
bought them a
remember
few
that
lunches.
series? That you remember that series, and I don't know if they still do it. It certainly was disgusting whenever I would read it, which was like, I forget the exact title, but it was something to the effect of The Interview with the Corner Office, which they would talk to like the CEOs of the various companies, particularly
No,
financial
but I can
companies.
I never read that. I don't recall reading it, but I can just imagine the nightmare.
Yeah,
Go
yeah, they'd
ahead.
talk to Lloyd Blankfein, and they say like, yeah, and in half they would, yeah, they'd give the space for them to get lob softball questions about what makes a good leader and blah 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 kind of shit.
Yeah,
But they
what
would
makes a good
I felt
leader?
like half the article was always talking about the details of the office.
Yeah,
It's like, oh, this nice table and this
yeah,
overlooks Central Park and all that other kind of shit. Part of the reason I paid attention to that is because they interviewed someone I was working on behalf of or with, and I was paying attention to it there, and then I just saw what the series was like, and that's the kind of shit you would get. And yeah, the Financial Times is a bad example of that, but also like the Economist and anything else, like all these guys, they're very
capitalism's
friendly.
cheerleaders. Capitalism's cheerleaders, right?
Yeah,
And all these
they're very
mainstream,
friendly
yeah.
and with
And
each other.
what I
And
loved was I started reading in 2008. I started reading Eve Smith's Naked Capitalism. At first, I thought Eve Smith was a guy, but it's a pseudonym for a former investment banker, and she was like I think she was in Goldman. I mean, everybody goes through Goldman. It's like,
mhm.
I mean, everybody top tier goes through Goldman at least for a couple of years. It's like the finishing school, right? And so she had been in Goldman, and then like Nakamura, I think. She'd been around, and she had the dimmest view of capitalism and these people. Yeah, because it's an insider's perspective, an insider who had become an outsider for whatever reasons, either by choice or by circumstance, right? And she had the dimmest view of these people, and she didn't trust any of these fuckers, right? And I started reading her stuff, and it was really good. It was a really good blog at the time. Now it's sort of like become a little bit lefty and kind of ridiculous, but at the time in 2008, 2009, it was like on the money. And I also started reading Zero Hedge. What do you think of Zero Hedge?
I like them in part because they always have the most fun titles
Yeah.
and the most fun articles, like good, entertaining shit like that. It was funny because I've been going through a very long period of like reducing the amount of news that I read. And I remember when when you're young, you always say, "Oh, you want to be the guy who has like this." When they existed, 7 newspapers around, so you could always know what was going on. And I had, Time magazine I was a reader of, as like you had mentioned. Times, the New Yorker, all of this shit. And, over the time, and in reality, I don't know that I could 100% tie it to the financial crisis, but it certainly seems to be in parallel with that. Like from '08 through today, I've just like crossed off the list of all the main things that that I would read. I'm like, nope, I don't get anything good out of the Times, New Yorker, New York Times, all of this other stuff. And yeah, from time to time, I would read things like Zero Hedge and sometimes Business Insider, sometimes not.
Well, Business Insider was interesting because it started off as alternative, and they were on the ball. They were talking like real shit. But as Henry Blodgett realized that he could make a shit ton of money off of it, because that was his aim, because Henry Blodgett and a lot of people in the alt media, alt financial media, Henry Blodgett had a little scandal, and I forget, he'd gotten into some trouble. I don't know if it was legal trouble, but he'd put that behind it, but reputationally he was sort of like on the outs insofar as finance is concerned. He couldn't get a job. And so he set up Business Insider as being an alt financial press. And it had always been slick from the get-go. But early on, it was giving you the real scoop. It was telling you shit that was true, right? It was telling you things that the mainstream was not reporting on. And Business Insider on the early days, like I forget when it started, up until I'd say 2013, 2014, it was on the ball. But then it started getting corporate because he started getting those sweet offers to buyout offers. And he started making it more mainstream, more palatable for potential investors and potential buyers, and which is a shame. But a lot of other sources, a lot of DIY blogs popped up, and they were giving you incredible insights. I remember there was this one guy called Macro Man who shut down his blog. But this guy was a bond trader. And this fucker, he was working in London. And he would give you the skinny of exactly what the hell was going on. And he would tell you exactly how he was trading that day and everything, right? And it was really a fascinating insight into a real trader and the view that he had, the disillusioned, cynical view he had of his own industry. That was the most eye-popping thing of it all. I don't know if you had something like that too on your diet.
Honestly, no. I mean, I was at the time I was still reading Slate of all things, but Slate, you got to keep in mind, Slate during the time when Christopher Hitchens was still alive was not the Slate of today. The Slate of today has as their ad bumper, we're going to hold Trump's feet to the fire. Help us by becoming a member of Slate Plus or whatever the fuck they call it. It's they went off the salon deep end kind of.
Yeah,
like,
they really did.
They were still reasonable for a long time.
Yeah, no,
I'd say up until 2012 at least.
They really lost their shit over Trump. I mean, they've gone fucking insane. I mean, now going there, it's just like, Trump goes up.
It's Salon. It's like reading Salon, and it was not like that. It really wasn't.
No, it was very reasonable. But the thing that happened to me during the GFC was that all of these alt press, I just started looking around for them because the mainstream was saying such shit. Remember when Jim Cramer had that meltdown in August of '08?
Oh God, I feel like I think I know what you're saying, but what was the topic again?
No, he was saying he was screaming, "They have to do something! They have no idea what's going on out there. It's a carnage, And he was basically, screaming for the government to bail out the bankers. That's what he was basically saying. It was so goddamn funny. I mean, he lost his shit in a way that Jesus. I mean, God, it was so fucking funny.
Can I tell you something interesting about Jim Cramer? A little tangent, but he was a law student of Alan Dershowitz's. I even think he worked on the famous Klaus von Bülow case.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And so what's interesting about him is that, he's a similar kind of what I hinted at earlier when I had told you about my red pill moment. He's a similar kind of guy, which is like when you go to if you have them talking about what they think is good for society and everything, they'll give you all the most wonderful liberal talking points. He has this idea of like, oh, there's a charity thing that I want to do but when it comes down to his business, he's all for the, Wall Street, go for all the money, cut the throats if you need to. And then if you feel like doing a charity, do it afterwards attitude, which is a common thing I see all the time. And I see it more among liberals. Not to say that there isn't hypocrisy amongst conservatives, but I feel like even conservatives are operating under the idea that you can't really disassociate the morality from the core business of what you're doing. They have a harder time doing it than the liberals do. Liberals are much more comfortable having a two-faced attitude towards this, and he represents that in spades.
Yes, you're absolutely right, because you're absolutely right in your diagnosis that the left or liberals have a far easier time of disassociating the morality of their actions. And sort of like, I'll be an immoral fuckhead on the job, but on my off hours, I'll give to charity and do this shit, And it's really weird because it's liberals who sort of like make a to-do about their charity work, as if that's the thing that shows that they're good people, but they never talk about their actual work, whereas conservatives tend to view what they're doing as moral. I mean, I know conservatives who say all the time, I'm a good person. I give decent employment to 100, 500, 1,000 people or more.
Right.
And they refer to their job and the thing that they are doing that is providing employment for, 100 people, which represents, because of their families, it represents, giving good, decent employment to, decent living to 400, 500 people. And they're proud of that. They don't talk about their charity work because their charity work is just not relevant.
Well, I'll tell you this, and I won't go into the specific details of it, but the only time, and this is at my last job, so I'm not, risking anything. The only people, myself included, who ever came close to having a moral objection to doing a particular case or not were the conservative folks. The liberal guys or gals in the crowd had no fucking compulsion. In fact, the idea that you would even have that kind of compulsion to them was kind of anathema. It's like, why would you put your career advancement at risk kind of attitude was the position they would have had on it. I won't go into the specifics of what examples they were, but
that's kind of like that's psychotic, because psychopaths act that way. In the sense of like what they're doing, they don't care about the morality of what they're doing, but they realize that for social reasons they have to pretend to be nice, so they do these nice things, quote unquote, but they don't really feel it. They just think of it as a necessary thing that they have to do to get along with society. That's the attitude of a psychopath.
And I think that's, they always say you shouldn't bring the psychoanalysis into politics, but it's hard to do. It's hard to ignore it sometimes, because precisely, like I said, for me, it was that big red pill moment that, the liberal folks could still say to the people on the street, why don't you put effort into getting a job, which is not too far removed from, and again, it's related to the whole media
There's no
thing.
bread, let them eat cake.
Yeah, let them eat cake. But also remember that in the last election, when the National Review of all places published that guy who said that the white working class just needs to die already. Remember that?
God. Yeah, that was the end of the National Review.
Because when I read that title,
yeah.
When I read that title, it brought back that memory of, why don't these folks just get a fucking job?
There's no bread, let them eat cake. That's where it all comes from. They're all descendants of Marie Antoinette.
And it's also funny as well that, again, if you take a look at the genealogy of these things, American Yankee liberalism is the modern manifestation, both physically and intellectually, from Puritanism, which is Protestantism, right? And that is a byproduct of disgust with things like indulgences, the idea that you could buy your way to salvation.
No, I think
yet that's what we just described.
No, I think that what we're talking really, it's not Protestant anymore. It hasn't been Protestant for several decades. Generations.
Well, of course, that's irrelevant to the genealogy.
Well,
these guys are. Protestantism is just a path to material atheism. I don't care what the Protestants tell me. That's what it goes to.
Well, I tend to think of it as finance has been culturally dominated by Jews since what, the 70s, 80s? I mean, it's numerically they dominate it. Okay, whether you like it or not. And I'm not being anti-Semitic. I'm just stating facts, right? The heads of most of the major banks in the United States, they're Jewish people, and most of the people on the boards of directors of those banks are Jewish as well. Most of the traders, look down the line, if the proportion of Jewish people in the United States is what, 2%, 3%, and in banking it's something like in the top tier, in the C-suites of the banks, it's much higher. It's what, 50%, perhaps more. So
it could be that high, but still, like the rank and file and the other half of the C-suite are generally WASPs and some Catholics, but by and large WASPs.
Okay, but I think that morality has to have permeated the whole environment. Or let me phrase it: it has permeated it, and to pretend that otherwise is ridiculous. I mean, you can't say that this particular moral approach has maintained through the decades, even though they've been completely replaced by a different population. Okay, so anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that, see, it seems to me that a lot of it has to do with appearing to be moral for the sake of public consumption, even as you act and do things that are immoral and that you recognize as immoral. I don't know. I think that.
No, you can buy. It's the general idea. You can buy your way off.
Yes.
You can buy your way out of a problem.
Exactly.
Because all problems at the end of the day are just transactions that are yet to be resolved.
Exactly. You said it exactly in a much better way than I was able to. It's all transactional. It's all that morality is something to be traded, bought and paid for. Okay. And so you do an immoral act over here, but over there, you're giving, food to the poor, or giving money for research for children with cancer or some shit like that, right?
Well, I mean, it all even predicated into the resolution of the various litigations that might go out. I mean, and it isn't just in the financial crisis; it was everywhere beyond it too, which was the idea that, I caused a problem. What is it going to cost? Or, hey, am I going to do this risky thing? What's my cost-benefit analysis to get my way out of it?
Yeah.
People. It's funny how people say, you can't put $1 on these things. Well, the fact of the matter is, it's very easy for us to put $1. We do it all the time.
Yes, exactly, all the fucking time, and it's look, but the thing that I'm really concerned about, okay, irrespective of the morality of banking and all the rest of that shit, what I'm really concerned about is, see, I believe that in the long run, chaos is always better than stasis. That it is useful to have stasis or stability, but there comes a point where that stability, the cost of maintaining that stability, creates more and more problems that will overwhelm the system altogether. Okay, I guess it comes from earthquakes in Chile. Chile is on the edge of the, is a country created by earthquakes, because it's the South American plate crashing into the Pacific plate. And the reason that Chile is so long geographically is that there is a mountain range separating Chile from Argentina. The mountain range was created, the Andes, of course, was created by the crash of the South American plate against the Pacific plate. Now, the Pacific plate is sliding under the South American plate, right? And as it slides under, the friction of it pushes up against the South American plate and shoves up the Andes Mountains, right? And it creates the Central Valley of Chile, okay? Now, what happens with Chile is that because of this geological reality, there are earthquakes in Chile all the time. In point of fact, Chile, the most powerful earthquake ever recorded happened in Chile in 1960. It was 9.8, I believe, and it was catastrophic. It lasted 15 minutes. 15 minutes of the earth moving. Think about that, okay? It was catastrophic. It destroyed a third of the country, if not more. It made little streams, turned them into navigable rivers. I'm not kidding. There's the Valdivia River that before had been just a little stream, okay, that, kids could wade across it, okay, and afterwards, ships could sail up it, okay. It's unbelievable. Anyway, the thing that I'm saying is that in Chile, we have earthquakes all the time, and that those constant little earthquakes, okay, are almost sometimes daily, okay? I mean, the little ones, like 3.0, 2.5, right? No, it happened here, it happened there. I mean, on the news, it'll be like the third story of the news feed. They'll say, oh, and up in north, there was a 4.2 earthquake. No damage. I mean, it's that kind of like a daily event that it's not even the priority news story, right? Now, why am I bringing this up? In 2010, there was an 8.8 earthquake. Okay, I lived through that. Okay, and not only that, I was awake on the 15th floor of my building because my apartment was on the 15th floor. And I was awake, playing on my laptop, surfing the internet when it hit. It was an 8.8. It lasted, I don't know, like 5 minutes or something. My building whipped around like a merry-go-round. It was unbelievable, right? But here's the story, the point I want to make. 3 buildings collapsed in all of Santiago, a city of over 5 million people, okay? And it turns out that these 3 buildings that collapsed, they'd all been built by the same guy. And it turned out that under investigation, he had paid off some guy so as not to use the good rebar and had, sort of like not done his job properly. And they went to jail ultimately, okay? Of thousands and thousands of buildings, none other collapsed, okay? There were very few deaths in Santiago because no building collapsed. In a city called Concepcion, one building did collapse, but it actually didn't collapse like a pancake. What happened is that it tipped over because the earth directly below it had shifted by a meter. And so the building, it didn't collapse like a pancake. It literally tipped over. And because it tipped over and didn't break, here's the weird thing. The people inside survived because they got like thrown around inside their rooms as the building fell over. Okay, but it didn't collapse on top of their heads, right? Now, why am I bringing all of this up? Why am I saying, Chilean construction is so good? It's because they have constant shocks, constant little earthquakes, and it keeps everybody honest about building. Like that one guy, that one builder who had built these 3 little, and they weren't big buildings. They were like 2-story apartment complexes, or 3-story apartment complexes. And they didn't collapse completely. They sort of like were severely damaged and partly collapsed, but it wasn't like a complete failure. Okay, but the point I'm trying to make is that the builders in Chile know about this. Everybody knows about it, and so the buildings are more robust because everybody constantly feels these little shocks. It's not that they hear about it, or it's not like old news from way back when. It's constant all the time. Okay. I mean, rarely does a year go by when you don't feel a little tremor at some point. And whenever you feel a little tremor in Chile, everybody is the same. It's like, oh, let's wait. Oh, is it going to be a big one or it's just a little one? Oh, it's a little one? Okay, we go on our way. It's like that. It's kind of funny. But that constant those little bumps, okay, they're good for the system because they create a robustness over time. But the cult of stability, which has been the default mode of Western societies over the last 30 years, they can't withstand a shock. You see what I'm trying to say? A very long-winded.
I appreciate your quick summary of anti-fragile. Yes, I do.
Yeah,
which effectively is the argument you're making.
Yeah, basically. And I think that the financial system, they just. Okay, I'm not making any more sense. I think that we should change the conversation.
Well, no. Let's put it this way. With regard to the financial system, it's more fragile than ever, but because, ironically enough, there's a lot of buffer that was put in place to insulate it from troubling things and having to face troubling things. Ironically enough, it's made the system more fragile because, all the risks associated with it, don't worry, someone other than you will bear those. In other words, they've socialized the risk, they've privatized the gains. And this is the typical nature of, unfortunately, a lot of our financial system and has been for a while now. Have we resolved any of that? No, it continues. And the funny thing is, it just feels like that attitude is permeating beyond finance, right? I mean, if you look at every single kind of industry, major industry, from like automotive, consumer packaged goods, what have you, you can probably build the same chart that you could in finance, which is to say, take the number of players of a certain size 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 20 years ago, Compare that to today, and you can see all of the consolidation that's taken place. In fact, I've seen those charts all the time. They'll even give you the flow charts of how all these brands and whatnots came together. It's the nature of what it is right now, which means that everything is now too big to fail. Yeah. And now we've made a as you said earlier, we made a pleasure out of things that are big. It's like, oh, look at this. I work for the biggest bank.
Yeah.
Right. I work for the biggest, consumer packaged goods provider. I work for the biggest auto player. Because we have the sense that somehow, if you got into the big company, you're somehow more capable and more successful, which isn't even anywhere close to any vague conception of an American dream of success. Success is on a much more personal level, oftentimes, not in your absorption into a gargantuan whole of which you are not known. You are just another piece of the system. So now I'm waxing philosophical, going beyond my ability to speak articulately, but hopefully you get what I mean.
Yeah. Well, we're over an hour, so I think that we should call it a podcast. But let's do a little self-analysis. I think that we sort of like, in my own case, I feel that I skirted around the issue, but I didn't really get at it, and I haven't really, I don't think that this podcast on my end was the best that I could have done. I gotta work on it. But I'll just have to inflict this on the listener. So sorry, listener. Hello?
No. I was letting you have your moment.
I'm just getting meta. I don't know. I'm just like, it's that, look, I think that I'm really, in general, just depressed about the situation because I feel that it's going to collapse. But at the same time, I feel a little bit like Chicken Little. The sky is falling, the sky is falling. And they keep propping the system up. Because look, going about the GFC, it's been 10 fucking years since GFC. And the Federal Reserve has been able to successfully implement ad hoc solutions to the problem. And just, keep the day of reckoning at bay. And so I'm thinking to myself, am I just smoking something and that I don't realize that everybody else is right and I'm wrong? Or is the sky truly going to fall and it's going to be much, much worse than anybody can anticipate?
Well, here's the thing, and I hate to be the one to say this, that's every single political decision has been resolved around the short-term thinking, right? Yeah. Every political leader has conscientiously or subconsciously adopted the Keynesian notion that in the long term we're all dead. Right. The meaning behind that is all decisions are short term, and it doesn't have to be just economics. It could be any kind of situation that's troublesome. Right. The big example you could use, if we're going to talk about the UK, the immigration problem. What Enoch Powell always said, to the effect of every politician is just postpone the inevitable because it'll be they know someone will have to deal with it, but it won't be them. That's the attitude everybody has. I know someone will deal with it. It won't be me. My job is to make sure that I isolate or insulate away from everybody the worry of trouble down the way. And the thing is, you're not going to get out of that, right? You have a system and structure set up that short-term thinking is prioritized over long-term thinking. You see it in the financial results, in which every quarter you have to hit your numbers. You see it in the political system, which is every 2 years you got to stand for a fucking election, or 4 years or 6 years, depending on what job you have. We do not have a system designed for long-term thinking. Part of the reason being is, to steal another Taleb line, we really don't have skin in the game. We're all managers of someone else's problems. At least the leadership is.
Yeah.
So that's my black pill for the day. But my attitude for that is, revealing that isn't necessarily a black pill. Because what the problem you're trying to fix is, and frankly, the solution is apparent and obvious in my mind as to how you get rid of short-term thinking. The challenge is actually implementing it.
What's the solution to replacing short-term thinking?
The solution to replacing short-term thinking is to remove short-term incentives. In other words, in finance, I would reduce, partly the notion of publicly traded businesses themselves are part of the problem that I would want to get, that I would want to resolve. In politics, the solution is the fact that you shouldn't have people running for office so often. You should have people in longer term, but with less ability to renew those terms. In other words, I'll give you a longer term as whatever job you have, but I will limit the amount of times you can run. So therefore you have that long-term thing resolved. And then you also have to figure out a way to get people tied to their local constituency more.
My thinking would be, insofar as banking, for instance, what we're being sort of talking about is turn them all into private banks in the literal sense, because people talk about private banking, but what I mean in the sense of the partners own the bank, okay, and the partners are personally liable to the losses of the bank, and that would solve a lot of fucking problems right away. The Swiss have that model. And they have been very, very good bankers over the centuries, precisely because of that, because they insist that the partners, their own assets, personal assets, are in the game. And so what do the bankers do? They make very, very cautious decisions because they don't want to lose their house.
Right. And that's the other thing people forget about publicly traded companies. The managers of publicly traded companies, they sometimes act like they certainly act like they run the show because they do, but they don't own the show. You as the shareholders in theory own everything. Yeah. You've hired out these guys. And people say, oh, well, they get paid in options. Like, trust me, a set of options is not the same thing as saying I own a third of this company that I gotta, I'm gonna run. It's not anywhere close.
Yeah, it's the issue of, like, for instance, when you have like a lot of money, a lot of assets, right? It's not only that you're worried about your own livelihood, you're thinking to yourself, well, this patrimony is going to be passed on to my children, so I better make sure that I maximize it and I put it in the safest things possible. I mean, your whole mentality starts to change radically. You're not particularly concerned about how you did in a year or two. You're worried, retrospectively, 5 years, 10 years. How are you doing in that scale? Short term, a year or two, it means nothing. But my thinking is that, look, all of this ties into me, at least, to the political notion that I'm sort of like developing in my own case, is the notion of decentralization. That should be a literally a political movement to decentralize everything. That we should be making the effort to decentralize and add a little chaos, control chaos, into the different environments that we want to preserve and to preserve the health of these various systems. For example, I'm all against breaking up the banks into smaller units. Breaking the investment banking side from the trading side and just making them into smaller units as opposed to the big units that we currently have. Ditto with the online world. I'm all in favor of taking Amazon and chopping it off, slicing it off into smaller parts. The same with Facebook, the same with Google, the same with all of these companies, because I think that even though these monopolistic practices do cost less to the consumer in many ways, I think that the instability inherent in these systems and the monopolistic power of these systems is such that it's worthwhile for us clients, for us customers, to pay a little bit more to eliminate that kind of control, that kind of potential corruption. I think in the long run it's a beneficial thing, and that we should be aiming to decentralize everything. And I'm trying to figure out a way to create this notion of decentralization into a political movement or a political paradigm that people can get behind. I mean, you see what I'm aiming at? I don't know if this even sounds sane, but I'm curious about what you think about it.
Well, so you have my natural sympathies. Funny enough, like, if you want to go back to it, in the American context, someone can turn around and not without reason say to you, well, they tried that before and the Civil War ended in the the Union's victory and the consolidation of power. It's slightly different context, but it's still the same kind of idea. The whole notions of a federated system with a very strong autonomous local state government being able to go its own way somewhat separately from the central authority was kind of nixed at that point. The funny thing is it took a century to extend it even further, but there was a path of centralization that was above and beyond just government. It went to a lot of other things as well. So someone that may put a damper on it to the effect at which people still think about the Civil War as definitively resolving that question. I don't think it has, but that's another story. The other funny thing is, yeah, you have my natural sympathies, and I would think that, some left-wing people might have those sympathies. Some do, but others don't. And it's funny, you'll love this little tidbit. I occasionally, I have a Marxist friend. I have a lot of people, friends on a variety of different perspectives.
Don't tell me you're a secret commie.
Well, I did used to be part of a communist organization.
Which one?
I won't say because it's too small. You'd be able to figure out what you
Okay.
I'm no longer in it. But the friend of mine there, I would get into arguments with him because he would say, well, I liked it. It was good when AT&T controlled all of the telephone industry because, it was efficient and you could get good service and the quality of the phones was up.
That wasn't true.
What are you talking about? That's not even, and let's even say it was true back then. It's certainly not true now. I don't go around saying, a bank like Citibank has the best quality service. No. I guarantee you it is not. If anybody who's ever had Citibank knows exactly what I'm talking about. But the thing is, it doesn't have to just be Citibank. JP Morgan and Chase is the same fucking way. Bank of America is the same fucking way. I can't think of another bank because guess what? There are probably very few other banks outside of very small local banks.
Yeah, exactly.
That you can go to.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that it's catastrophic. But it's that this bigness, this worship of bigness, is across the entire society. And the bigness, big companies, what do they want? They want stability at all costs. And stability breeds fragility. And fragility, the first big shock, well, we saw it in 2008. I think that there's going to be another, and it's going to be catastrophic. And this time, they're not going to be able to save them. I don't think that they're going to have enough money to save them. Because let's face facts, the American government is going bankrupt. They are getting to the point where they are no longer going to be able to service the federal government debt. I mean, everybody who says that the Fed is keeping interest rates low to help pick up the economy, I disagree. I think that they've done the math and they realize that if they raise interest rates, the federal government will not be able to make its interest payments on treasuries. Has anybody actually done the math on that?
I don't know offhand. You'd have to look it up, and I'm sure that's something you can look up pretty fairly easily. I'm surprised Zero Hedge hasn't done anything on it, to be candid.
Yeah. But look, the federal government debt is just catastrophic. This latest budget that Trump signed, it's going to make what, $1 trillion deficit within how long is it going to be? Within like 5 years or something like that?
Shorter than you think.
Yeah. I mean, are these people fucking high? Okay. I mean, $1 trillion deficit. That corresponds to roughly 6-7% of the gross domestic product of the United States. Holy fucking shit. That's just catastrophic. The government, that's the size of the hole that the government has. The government. I mean, isn't anybody realizing that this is fucking insane? Who's going to buy all that goddamn debt? How are they going to be able to finance it? I'm sorry. I mean, I know I'm ranting, but it's just like this desire to keep everything on an even keel, of keep up all of these various programs and not cancel them, not cut them, and just save money and assign resources to where they're needed as opposed to giving money to everything. I mean, this is fucking crazy. I mean, you see where I'm aiming at. You see my point in all of this rant, right?
Well, what's funny to me is, ironically enough, America, the country that supposedly is known for hating bureaucracy more than others, has never yet gone through the kind of austerity measures that the EU forced on its members.
Yeah.
You know, and to be fair, we don't offer as to the citizens as much in theory as the EU's member states offer to their citizens. But I guarantee you, most of those EU states went through, we got to really tighten our belts here, and to the point where it was almost like a political problem in a lot of instances to have to deal with that. I don't think like we've ever really gone through an actual tightening of the belt that I can recall.
No. Historically, the United States has never gone through a belt tightening. They've moved money around, and some programs have taken a hit for various reasons, political reasons. But no, there's never been an across-the-board belt tightening in the United States. I don't think that America politically could withstand an across-the-board belt tightening. I think that when that day comes, when that day of reckoning comes, which is inevitable as far as I'm concerned, but inevitable can take a long time sometimes. But if it is to come, I don't think that American civil society would get through that crisis very well. Well, look, that's the whole point of the book I'm writing now. Okay, that American society would collapse catastrophically once that moment comes. I mean, that's the very point of the Secret History of the American Crash, which is the novel that I'm writing. But see, it's one thing to write a novel, and the other thing is to really contemplate the reality of that. So okay, look.
Well, in theory, your novel should be some degree of a exorcising of that demon.
Yeah, we'll see how that goes. So anyway, we've gone on for an hour and 20, and I think we've bored our audience enough. So we're going to call it a podcast. This is Coach Red Pill signing off. Dr. Benway, why don't you take us out?
Everybody, I want you to buy American Treasury bonds, and I want you to invest in Goldman Sachs, even though one share is probably a lot more money than you'd want to pay, because I have to tell you, after this conversation, I want you all to feel confident in our financial system, and I want you to do nothing along the lines of shorting any of these investments. No, would you?
Okay, by the way, he was kidding, just in case the SEC gets annoying or anybody gets annoying. We're just kidding. Of course, we're not recommending any buying or selling any stock or anything like that. We're just kidding around. So anyway, that's our podcast for today, and hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.
Take care.